Beyond the traditional battlefield confrontations, the Vietnam War plunged into a realm of darkness so profound that it defies comprehension. Its scars, etched into the memory of humanity, tells tales of brutality that transcend the horrors of conventional war. One of the most horrifying aspects was the weaponization of sexual violence, a deliberate and systematic campaign used as a tool of terror and domination. These atrocities were not isolated incidents, but emblematic of a broader strategy to dehumanize and break the will of civilian populations. After centuries of French colonial rule, Vietnam's path to independence began with a complex series of political negotiations and conflicts. The French colonized Vietnam in the mid-19th century, and the region became part of Indochina under French control. During their rule, the French exploited Vietnam's resources while enforcing Western political, economic, and cultural systems. This long period of colonization left the Vietnamese people discontented and yearning for independence. After World War II, the nationalist movement in Vietnam gained strength, led by the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist group under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Minh fought against French forces and sought to expel colonial rule. This conflict culminated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where the Viet Minh achieved a decisive victory. This battle forced the French to negotiate their withdrawal from Vietnam, leading to the Geneva Accords in 1954. The Geneva Accords marked a turning point in Vietnam's modern history. This agreement effectively split the nation at the 17th parallel, creating two separate regions, North Vietnam, led by the Communist Party and Ho Chi Minh's government, and South Vietnam, governed by an anti-communist regime backed by Western allies, particularly the United States. The Accords established a temporary demilitarized zone to separate the two regions, and a promise was made that elections would be held to unify the country. However, these elections were never carried out due to fears that Ho Chi Minh's government would win, as the majority of the Vietnamese population supported communism. The geopolitical split created by the Geneva Accords would prove to be a catalyst for the prolonged conflict that would escalate into the Vietnam War. North Vietnam sought to unite the entire nation under a communist government, while South Vietnam, supported by Western powers, wanted to prevent this unification. This division would become a symbol of Cold War rivalry, with the United States and its Western allies eager to halt the spread of communism in Southeast Asia as part of their broader domino theory. According to this theory, if one nation fell to communism, neighboring nations would likely follow, leading to the spread of communist influence across the region. In the years leading up to the full-scale American military intervention, the political situation in South Vietnam grew increasingly unstable. South Vietnam's government struggled with corruption, leadership crises, and a lack of popular support. At the same time, communist insurgents in the South began organizing their opposition to the government. These insurgents came to be known as the Viet Cong, a mix of communist guerrillas and civilians who sought to overthrow the government of South Vietnam and reunify the nation under communist rule. The Viet Cong employed a mix of sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and strategic insurgencies, making it increasingly difficult for conventional military efforts to suppress their movement. The Viet Cong's rise to prominence came in tandem with mounting dissatisfaction among the rural South Vietnamese population, which felt marginalized and oppressed by the South Vietnamese government and its policies. This growing insurgency posed a direct threat to South Vietnam's stability, leading the United States to adopt a series of anti-communist strategies to counter this threat. The United States' initial entry into the Vietnam conflict was driven by its commitment to the Cold War policy of containment, a strategy aimed at stopping the spread of communism globally. U.S. policymakers, particularly under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and later administrations, feared that if communism spread unchecked in Southeast Asia, it would trigger a domino effect, with neighboring nations falling one by one into communist control. This belief was rooted in geopolitical fears that communism, led by the Soviet Union and supported by China, would undermine Western influence and U.S. economic interests. As such, U.S. support for South Vietnam emerged as part of an effort to stabilize the region and prevent a communist takeover. The first American military advisors were sent to South Vietnam in the late 1950s to assist the South Vietnamese government in countering the growing insurgency led by the Viet Cong. Initially, these advisors provided military training, intelligence, and support to South Vietnamese troops. However, the political and military situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate as guerrilla tactics grew more effective, and the South Vietnamese government struggled to contain the insurgency. By the mid-1960s, the situation in South Vietnam became increasingly dire. The guerrilla nature of the conflict, marked by ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run tactics, rendered traditional military strategies largely ineffective. Despite efforts by the South Vietnamese government and military to suppress insurgent activity, the Viet Cong maintained a strong presence, exploiting rural areas, civilian support, and the difficulties of terrain. As pressure mounted on the South Vietnamese forces, the United States began deploying greater numbers of troops directly to the region. By 1965, U.S. troop numbers had grown dramatically, with over 200,000 soldiers stationed in Vietnam. The initial deployment saw the shift from U.S. military advisors providing training and guidance to direct combat support in the war effort. This marked the beginning of a full-scale U.S. military intervention rather than merely an advisory role. The U.S. escalation was predicated on the belief that a strong military presence would suppress the insurgency and support the South Vietnamese government. This was also part of a broader effort to strengthen the military position of South Vietnam and reduce the threat of communism spreading to the region. As U.S. soldiers began arriving in larger numbers and engaging in combat, the realities of the war became evident. The war was not fought on open battlefields with clear lines of demarcation, but in the dense jungles, rural villages, and urban areas of South Vietnam, terrain unfamiliar to many of the soldiers and filled with civilian populations. The soldiers faced challenges such as navigating treacherous terrain, dealing with inadequate intelligence, and encountering guerrilla tactics that they had little experience combating. Many soldiers found themselves unprepared for the nuances of guerrilla warfare, and this contributed to significant military and strategic missteps. The brutality of guerrilla warfare placed enormous stress on American troops who struggled to distinguish between combatants and civilians. The lack of understanding of Vietnamese culture, geography, and military strategy, coupled with the exhaustion of prolonged combat, led to a series of mistakes and tragic acts of violence against civilian populations. Many soldiers became caught in cycles of retribution, targeting innocent civilians in response to the attacks they faced. These errors, often intentional but brutal nonetheless, added to the suffering of the Vietnamese people and eroded U.S. credibility and the legitimacy of its military mission. The media began playing a critical role in exposing these realities, despite efforts to censor war reporting. Though American officials sought to maintain control over public perceptions by limiting the extent of media coverage, journalists managed to report on the horrors of the conflict. Images of suffering, war crimes, and atrocities began to filter into American living rooms, bringing the war's grim realities into public consciousness. Sexual violence during the Vietnam War became far more than isolated instances of brutality. It evolved into a systematic tool of war, a deliberate weapon of subjugation, terror, and control. U.S. soldiers engaged in a widespread campaign of sexual violence, which included forced rapes, systematic abductions, and the execution of victims after brutal assaults. These acts were not random, but part of a pattern of dehumanization, with civilians targeted to erode resistance and instill fear. Impunity was often the norm as American troops operated with little accountability, knowing that their actions would likely go unpunished. Historical records and survivor testimonies highlight that rapes were frequently used as acts of punishment. Victims were often silenced, either through death, coercion, or intimidation, to prevent them from reporting their suffering. Entire communities were devastated by these crimes, with families torn apart by grief, loss, and fear. The Vietnam War brought with it another dark dimension, which was the establishment of brothel networks and the exploitation of vulnerable women. These networks were created near U.S. military bases, ostensibly intended to boost troop morale. However, their purpose was much darker, as many women, often minors, were forced into prostitution through coercion, abduction, and trafficking. These establishments became integral components of a cruel war economy that exploited vulnerable populations. Many women had no choice but to turn to prostitution as a means of survival, as the war and displacement left their families destitute and unable to access basic necessities. The conditions within these brothels were horrific. Women were subjected to constant violence, abuse, and exploitation, and stripped of their dignity and autonomy. The U.S. military's role in these networks was complex. While some officials remained complicit, others tacitly allowed these systems to thrive due to their economic and moral entanglements. These networks not only perpetuated the suffering of the Vietnamese people, but also contributed to the moral decay within the occupied regions, creating cycles of violence. One of the most infamous examples of American soldiers committing war crimes during the Vietnam War was the Hill 192 incident, which took place on November 19, 1966. It involved a group of 5 U.S. soldiers who targeted a 21-year-old Vietnamese woman named Phan Thao. Over a period of 5 days, she was subjected to repeated and brutal sexual violence at the hands of 4 of the soldiers. They repeatedly violated her, subjecting her to just unimaginable suffering. And to make matters worse, the crimes escalated when 2 of the soldiers decided to kill Phan Thao in order to silence her and cover up their crimes. This calculated act of murder was a final step in a chain of calculated and inhumane actions, as these soldiers ensured that their brutal assault would go unreported by eliminating the victim. The incident gained national attention when Robert Storby, a U.S. Army whistleblower, came forward with information about the atrocities. His courageous disclosure brought these events into the public eye, allowing the horrors of this crime to be exposed. However, despite the severity of the incident, the U.S. government's response was weak and inadequate. The soldiers involved were subjected to a trial, but the punishments they received were disproportionately light compared to the gravity of their actions. This outcome underscored the military's unwillingness to confront its own internal problems or address war crimes comprehensively. Trial and sentencing further emphasized the systematic denial and failure of leadership within the ranks. Despite clear evidence of atrocity, the soldiers were not subjected to harsh punishments, and the military hierarchy's refusal to properly investigate or hold individuals accountable allowed similar crimes to persist with impunity. The My Lai massacre, which occurred on March 16, 1968, represents another of the most infamous war crimes. Unlike isolated incidents, the My Lai massacre was a horrifying, systematic act of violence intended to crush Viet Cong resistance, but which descended into indiscriminate slaughter of civilian populations. It is one of the most well-documented and well-remembered events of the Vietnam War. The operation began as part of a search-and-destroy mission that aimed to root out Viet Cong insurgents from the hamlet of Sunai, located in Quang Ngai Province. The U.S. military, operating on the assumption that civilian areas were often breeding grounds for guerrilla resistance, sought to eradicate the Viet Cong by employing aggressive and unrestrained tactics. Sunai was suspected of harboring insurgents, and the mission was intended to destabilize and eliminate their influence in the region. However, the strategy employed by U.S. forces was flawed and deeply misguided, with tragic consequences. The soldiers involved in the operation belonged to Charlie Company, part of the U.S. Army's Americal Division. As they entered the hamlet of Sunai, their orders were to systematically eliminate any potential threats from the Viet Cong insurgents. However, these orders lacked critical oversight and failed to differentiate between combatants and civilians, leading to the indiscriminate targeting of non-combatant villagers. From the very beginning of the operation, soldiers engaged in a violent spree that spiraled out of control, with no clear boundaries between military objectives and acts of sheer terror. The assault began at approximately 8 a.m. that morning, and over the next several hours, U.S. soldiers used a combination of grenades, machine guns, and bayonets to kill hundreds of civilians. The attacks were particularly gruesome, with entire families slaughtered in their homes and on the streets. Reports suggest that many victims were executed as they attempted to flee the violence or surrendered in desperation. Soldiers showed no restraint as they killed indiscriminately, using modern weaponry to wipe out family without hesitation. The violence extended beyond Sunai's main streets and homes, with villagers being dragged from their shelters and killed in their attempts to hide from the advancing troops. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. Men, women, and children were rounded up and executed, often without any resistance. Reports suggest that soldiers would throw grenades into homes, burn villages, and fire indiscriminately, ensuring that entire families were killed in the process. In addition to gunfire and grenades, bayonets were used to kill civilians in close quarters, intensifying the brutal nature of the massacre. Estimates of the number of dead civilians vary, but it is widely accepted that over 500 civilians were killed during the massacre. Women, children, and elderly individuals made up a significant portion of these victims, most of whom were completely defenseless. Witnesses reported that the soldiers paused during their operations, even while helicopters provided aerial observation, to methodically execute these killings. Survivors recall the terror of attempting to escape, only to find no escape from the merciless advance of the U.S. troops. The massacre led to intense public outrage and investigation. Though the atrocities were undeniable, the response from military officials remained slow and insufficient. While a few soldiers were tried in connection to the massacre, the majority of those responsible remained unpunished. Many high-ranking officials avoided scrutiny, which further eroded public trust in the U.S. military and government. Sexual violence was not merely a random act during the war, but a deliberate and systematic strategy. Victims' psychological scars persisted for decades, with children born from these crimes referred to as liandian, facing marginalization, societal stigma, and exclusion. The broader international involvement in the war saw troops from allied nations other than the United States deployed to the region as part of the broader anti-communist coalition. Among these, South Korea played a significant role, contributing a large number of troops to the conflict. However, their involvement was marked by its own share of war crimes. South Korean troops were sent to Vietnam as part of a military support agreement between South Korea and the United States. Their presence in Vietnam was primarily intended to support the effort of U.S. forces in fighting the Viet Cong insurgency and North Vietnamese forces. Between 1964 and 1973, over 300,000 South Korean soldiers were deployed to South Vietnam. Although their initial mission was billed as aiding counterinsurgency operations, the conduct of South Korean soldiers in many areas revealed their complicity in a series of human rights violations and war crimes. One of the most significant areas of concern was violence against civilians. South Korean soldiers, often operating with little oversight or accountability, engaged in widespread acts of violence. Reports suggest that they committed atrocities such as looting, forced displacement, arbitrary killings, and sexual violence. Entire communities were subjected to terror as soldiers destroyed homes, confiscated resources, and forced civilian populations to flee their land. This forced migration often left people destitute with limited access to resources or safe havens. South Korean forces were also implicated in massacres that further amplified the suffering of Vietnamese civilians. These actions were frequently brutal and indiscriminate, with no efforts taken to distinguish between Viet Cong insurgents and innocent civilians. As was the case with other foreign troops, the lack of proper accountability mechanisms allowed soldiers to act with impunity. Efforts to hold the South Korean military accountable for these crimes proved challenging, as there was a systematic effort to suppress information and limit investigations. The denials and failures to prosecute war crimes only worsened the suffering of victims and created additional distrust among the civilian population. Furthermore, the South Korean government maintained significant political and economic interests in maintaining their troop presence in Vietnam and supporting anti-communist policies, which undermined justice for victims. The involvement of other allies such as Australia, Thailand, and New Zealand also faced controversies related to their conduct and their roles in aiding U.S.-led operations. The shared suffering and war crimes that extended across these international borders presented enormous challenges for reconciliation and justice after the war. Efforts to achieve accountability were hindered by the complex web of alliances, overlapping military strategies, and Cold War geopolitics. As countries finally withdrew their troops in the early 1970s, the suffering endured by Vietnamese civilians continued for decades, compounded by the absence of accountability and reparative justice.